Hello and welcome to the Tidal Cyber Fireside Chat series. We got this covered, an attack coverage introspection, where we talk about all things good and bad about attack and how coverage is done with it. Today we have Itzik from SafeBreach to discuss specifically his lessons learned as a longtime user of attack and how he's able to use attack to communicate about mapping, how their product maps to attack, how they leverage it internally, and anything else that really we can talk about with attack. As I mentioned, attack coverage is one of those often debated how good, how bad it is. Is it too generalized? Is it specific enough? But there's a lot of value to be had in understanding how you're actually able to defend against yourself. And so with that, let me first spin this over to Itzik so that he can talk about himself, introduce himself, and give a little bit of an explanation around the capabilities that SafeBreach provides.
Yeah.
So Itzik.
Thank you very much for having me, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the CTO and co-founder of SafeBreach, a leading company in the breach and attack simulation space. And MITRE ATT&CK actually came, I think, in the perfect time to help solve a problem for my users, which is how you slice and dice APTs and complex threats into steps. I think what we initially found, and I actually contribute some of my knowledge to the MITRE ATT&CK as well, is that the MITRE ATT&CK does a great job in being just broad enough to cover multiple type of threats. And so that's why quickly we kind of adopted it and ran with it within our product, and also as a company, it speaks out the language.
No, that's really helpful. And as you mentioned, you have been a longtime supporter of attack and definitely greatly appreciate that, both for my sides at MITRE and just part of the community as well. But I was wondering, like, has that story evolved at all, right? So you were using it like day one, pretty much, or close to it, to now where it's now 600 techniques. So have you found that how you've had to communicate it or use it has changed over those years?
So I've definitely seen a couple of differences, right? I mean, the early days, the adaptation of the MITRE ATT&CK framework was evangelist to some degree. And I think today a lot of people are already expecting to understand how different breach methods are logically mapped to it. So I think, from one hand, I have to explain less and less about why we're using that framework and more basically adapt to its mapping. I also think that, the MITRE ATT&CK as a concept is now evolving to ICS and cloud, has also helped tremendously, as there is kind of like a unified language that customers can kind of think about the realm and then expect to see a MITRE technique or a MITRE attack around that. I think with just everything, Frank, I think at some point the framework has become big and also a little bit confusing. And that's where we kind of got into the hard places where customers that look at MITRE ATT&CK a little bit in a disconnected fashion, maybe for more purely coverage, will try to mimic or simulate specific techniques without their context, and they will just get lost in the process. So there's also some challenges sometimes around specific techniques that are part of a bigger play.
That's a really interesting point, right? And I think that you're hitting on a very important one. It's that attack is at an abstract level purposefully, right? But trying to figure out the actual implementation details that adversaries do, right? There's some differences. And so when a customer comes to you and wants to talk about attack coverage, how do you navigate that? How do you put it in a way so that they can understand that there's a lot of nuance to that question? How do you guys handle that?
I think the best way to handle it and the way that we are choosing to do it is by understanding the customer needs first. I mean, again, the MITRE ATT&CK is a lens that you can look at the threat through those lenses and understand the relevant techniques and how they come together. But just trying to blindly score the most you can get on that particular map is not a very good use of your time and exercise. And also, most of the times, it won't coincide with the company security posture and risk management. I mean, let's be honest here, there's a lot of different techniques and sub-techniques there. Some of them are more rare than others, although they all have been observed in the wild. companies may not choose to put the same amount of money to either detect or mitigate every single one of them, right? So starting from the coverage point of view, we usually reverse the conversation to ask, okay, you're a customer in vertical X. What type of threats are you thinking of? What type of risk are you dealing with? And then let's understand how those risks and threats are mapped into the MITRE so you can have a reference point, but not the other way around.
I really like that, because at the end of the day, that is the essence of what we would call threat-informed defense here, right? It's really about trying to make an attack and the greater threat like your own, really understand it through the lens of your organization, because it is a big problem, right? Attack, when it started, was 70 some techniques when it was first released. Now it's up to close to 600 techniques and sub-techniques, and that's a lot to bite off. So I like the prioritization around specific threats and how to navigate that. And to that point, right, that's part of the reason why Tidal Cyber has gone the route we have, to provide the extra context around threats, right? So you click on a technique and you can understand what capabilities exist in the world, so you can understand as a defender what you can do maybe to address that, whether it be with protections or detections, or in your case, tests.
Yeah.
And so to that lens, what resonated with you about this effort? Why would a SafeBreach want to participate in this?
I think that, at least from an adversarial offensive approach, there aren't many frameworks that are going to the level of description that MITRE took the time to kind of found out and draw those guidelines within the framework. I mean, initially, we were using the Lockheed Martin kill chain approach, which is still a very good framework and a very logical way to describe what the attack or attack campaign looks like. It's more of a sequence with a start and an end. But then there is parts of it which becomes a little bit fuzzy, like actions on the machine and exploitation. This is where you and I, Frank, know that there is a variety of gray area that are not always a binary. I mean, that's where we as a company that creates those simulations for our customers, that takes the extra step to create different process injection techniques to show them the art of the possible. This is where in the other frameworks, things kind of converged into a singular binary thing, which I think it's also misleading, because again, you may be protected against some process injection techniques, but not all of them. It's not a binary. There needs to be a toggle there. And I think MITRE ATT&CK was the first framework that I saw that started to play and create the toggle to understand what percentage, if at all, you're understanding the threat and protecting against.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. And one of the things that spawns on from that line of thinking that you were just doing, I'm kind of interested in so there's procedure variation, right? Technique variation. But how do you guys handle specifically the concept around flows, right? So techniques not happening in isolation, right? That's another challenge that a lot of users experience with attack. And interested if you have any experiences through, again, your time with attack on how to kind of handle that, how to think about flows.
Definitely. So I think, over the years, and this is also a feature that is now exists publicly in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, is the attribution that exists to different threats, actors, and specific threat, like for instance, APT29. And then as a natural evolution of our platform, Frank, we have moved from independent atomic actions, which will be a MITRE technique or sub-technique, and we start speaking about the language of scenarios, because eventually a customer, when you look about APT29 or any APT out there, right, you have anything from your email gateway to endpoint to network security. The idea is that, and that's going back to some of what Lockheed Martin was trying to push in their cyber kill chain, is that you don't necessarily need to hit everything. I mean, ideally, depending on your budget and risk, you might have points everywhere, which makes you a greater security posture. But if you can prevent the lateral movement between your corporate and production, that particular thing can be a game changer. So you might be susceptible to the infiltration phase, but not to the lateral movement one. So again, whenever I hear a customer or prospect talking specifically about a technique, I'm trying to, again, zoom out and understand what is the threat here? What's the kill chain looks like? What's the bigger picture that the customer is trying to mitigate? And then, of course, coinciding with that, how much investment they have. Because they might be alarmed about the technique, but in reality, they might have not invested anything to detect and mitigate it.
So that again pulls out a really interesting concept in terms of not every technique matters the same, as you've kind of alluded to in a couple of your answers. And so interested in kind of how when testing, right? Do you still test all of them? Do you try to focus on the specific high impacts? Like how do you find that balance between hitting enough of it as a real adversary would versus making sure that you're hitting the ones that matter most for the end user?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not in a position to make any assumptions on my customer side to what kind of controls they have, anything from a hardening to a custom kernel to EDR solutions, networking, etc., behavioral. They may be positioned in their mind to test this nuance of a process injection. So again, if they choose to run it in the platform, that's what the platform will accommodate. But I mean, generally speaking, Frank, like one of the things that tends to be the most, I would say, confusing will be the discovery type of techniques, which some of them includes benign commands, which are just doing enumeration or dumping of certain different types of IPs or domains that computers associate with. Nothing which is, by design malicious. Nothing that, perhaps ITs and power users are not using from time to time to debug their own issues. And then when a customer only focus on that particular aspect, that's where the confusion arises, because we talked about this previously, file system and directory enumeration. Those are benign actions that can be taken by any user and some legitimate software as well. It does not mean you're subject to an APT. So if you're trying to judge your way to tackle an AP through to file enumeration, then you're in a very difficult journey, because you won't find off-the-shelf software that would use this as the pinnacle of the APT.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we always considered back through my times at MITRE and what I'm doing over here with Tidal is trying to figure out, okay, how much of that activity is necessary. And the reality of the situation is even things like discovery techniques. I've seen some innovative ways of utilizing them to create better detections, right? It might not be the one discovery technique on its own, but there are some really innovative ways of doing that. And I like the idea of just kind of being able to run the test, let the end user kind of decide, is that an important thing or not for them to kind of track, and whether they've got defenses in place to handle it. So we've kind of covered a pretty broad gambit of things, but as we kind of close out here, just interested if you have any other thoughts or comments around, again, your experience utilizing ATT&CK, or where you think it should go next, or anything along those veins.
Sure. So I think, like I said, I'm a big fan of ATT&CK, and I try to contribute as much as I can to the community back in that project specifically. I think, as I said, one of the amazing things that it brought clarity to the market in terms of how offensive people are organizing their campaign. It really opened the eyes of people that are not living in that space, how things would end up chaining together within the attack campaign, not just at the high level of the kill chain, but internally what the process could be doing next. But then I think what happened is certain levels of customers and users that adopted this framework sometimes confuse the IOC's aspects of it for the behavioral. And you and I talked about it in the past as well. So sometimes attack would, for instance, the file enumeration would include like commands like the dir command that you can write in PowerShell and cmd.exe, right? And certainly there were malwares, and there's evidence that they have used those commands to gather the output of your files and directory. Well, that's great, but then what's the value of running it as is? Right? What's the value of recreating this particular command versus the concept? And as you just said, there are some companies that evolve their detection and causality mechanism to include those aspects. But those particular IOCs are, again, I don't want to say worthless, but they're diminished compared to the behavior. And I think this is something that the framework could do a better job in differentiating, what's the end game of the adversary and what were non-implementation in the past. But those are by no means the extensive list of it. And things can be and will probably be modified and evaded in the future, because going one-to-one with the MITRE, talked about the challenge of testing perhaps irrelevant techniques like discovery. The sub-problem would be testing irrelevant technique and then sticking to an IOC, believing this is the right test. Right. And I think that's very confusing.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And I think one of the things that I would like to see ATT&CK expand is their work within data sources and data components and how those map into procedures. So it's not even just about how specific groups use, but what data they're using to really define the variations. So hopefully they continue to kind of evolve in that space, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that. But I really appreciate the insights as a longtime attack supporter and user that you've been able to provide into this, and appreciate SafeBreach's involvement with Tidal as we go off and launch this community edition of our platform that will bring light into what defenders can actually do to help solve the problems. And I think that for us, testing plays a big role in that, right? Being able to build up your confidence that things are actually going to work, that they do. So I definitely appreciate your support and your inclusion, and thank you for all your time. So with that, thank you.
Happy to be part of it. Thank you, Frank.